So now we are ready for our next panel on collusion, or the new McCarthyism. I'll do no more than hand you over to your excellent chair, Vanessa Gezari, who's James Madison Visiting Professor on First Amendment Issues at the Columbia University Journalism School, also National Security Editor of The Intercept. Vanessa.
We're about to hear what I'm sure will be a fascinating exchange over Russia's role in Western political life today. For at least the last 75 years, Russia has loomed large in the Western imagination. Cold War tales of spycraft, obsessive suspicion, and paranoia among members of the KGB, the CIA, and MI6 feel somewhat quaint now, but they were deadly serious at a time when Russia and the US appeared on track to annihilate one another and the entire planet. A fate that I learned while preparing this panel is still eminently possible. And I was actually looking at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has set its doomsday clock to 2 minutes to midnight, which is the closest to catastrophe it has been since 1953. So with that in mind, we're learning also about other kinds of weapons that are being used in this new war. Facebook and Twitter, platforms where people around the world have flocked to share revolutionary aspirations and pictures of their kids. Trolls and bots, hackers who Google American slang to make themselves sound more plausible when they talk to reporters. There are strange, obscure poisons, a radioactive isotope, a compound made from a rare Chinese flowering plant known as heartbreak grass, a nerve agent packaged in a perfume bottle. And there are countermeasures, some public and predictable, sanctions, diplomatic skirmishes, a deadly battle in eastern Syria, and some not yet known. Against this backdrop, we have US President Donald Trump, who has spent the last several decades raking in hundreds of millions of dollars, much of it from Russians hurriedly pushing money out of their economy and into the global market. And we have a Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, a lifelong spy, who has spent 20 years at the top of the Russian Federation. The nature of their relationship is the subject of this panel today. Trump calls Robert Mueller's investigation into Russia's role in his election a witch hunt. But Mueller has been pretty effective. So far, 3 members of Trump's inner circle have pled guilty to lying to federal investigators, including his former national security advisor and 2 former campaign aides. His former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, was found guilty of bank and tax fraud and is now working with Mueller. Mueller has also indicted a dozen alleged Russian GRU agents, a number of Russian individuals who are said to have worked for a troll farm, and several Russian companies. What does any of this prove? Time will tell. And that's important to remember for journalism, too. The kind of journalism that finds the truth takes time. It's not the quick hit, but the long look that will yield the most clarity. And today we're going to talk about some of the evidence that exists with our terrific panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Jane Bradley, who is an award-winning investigations correspondent for BuzzFeed News and a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a really amazing series she did on 14 suspicious Russia-linked deaths on British soil. Mary Dejevsky, who writes a weekly column for The Independent and also contributes to The Guardian and other publications. Mary is a former foreign correspondent in Moscow, Paris, and Washington, and she was in Moscow during the collapse of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Glenn Greenwald, who's up there presiding over all of us, hi Glenn, is one of 3 co-founding editors of The Intercept. He's a journalist, constitutional lawyer, and author of 4 New York Times best-selling books on politics and law. He has won many awards, including the 2010 Online Journalism Award for his investigative work on the abusive detention conditions of Chelsea Manning. He's probably best known for his 2013 NSA reporting based on documents leaked by Edward Snowden, for which he received almost every major journalism award, including the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. And last but not least, Jim Risen, a best-selling author and former New York Times reporter who's the Intercept senior national security correspondent. He won the 2006 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for his stories about the NSA's domestic spying program, and he was a member of the reporting team that won the 2002 Pulitzer for explanatory reporting for coverage of the September 11th attacks and terrorism. Jim was the target of very long, drawn-out U.S. government crackdown on journalists and whistleblowers. He waged a 7-year legal battle against the government at risk of jail and won. And he also serves as director of First Look Media's Press Freedom Defense Fund, which is dedicated to supporting news organizations, journalists, and whistleblowers in legal fights in which a substantive public interest, freedom of the press, or related human or civil right is at stake. So I'd like to kick this off by asking everyone on the panel to state your view of the case. How would you describe Russia's activities in regard to the 2016 US presidential election and Brexit? What has been proven and what hasn't? And if you can, please tell us one way in which your views on this have changed or evolved in the last, say, 2.5 years. And Glenn and I had a really interesting conversation about this the other day, so I wanted to start with you, Glenn.
So I think, first of all, thank you to everybody who's put together such an amazing panel, and Vanessa for framing the issues so well. I think that it is important what Vanessa said, which is that journalism and understanding events is about not the quick hit, but trying to understand things from the long view. And so I think it's really important just to begin a quick review of the last 2 years of how this entire question of Russia and Trump and collusion began, because it's often suggested that Trump and his defenders have changed their story or moved the goalposts about what the questions are. And sometimes that might be true, but I think that's often true of the people who have tried to elevate this story into some major geopolitical event. If you go back to 2016 and early 2017, the primary accusation that was being made, and it's the one that led to the appointment of a special counsel in the first place, because in order to have a special counsel, you need a crime, was not that Russia interfered in the election or that Donald Trump or his affiliates or officials were willing to accept after the fact information obtained by Russia that could be used to harm Hillary Clinton. The accusation was that Trump or Trump officials committed a crime by participating in being conspirators within the plot to hack the DNC and the John Podesta email inboxes. And there's a really interesting article from the Chicago Tribune a month before the election that begins by saying Hillary Clinton's top advisor, John Podesta, said the FBI is investigating Russia's possible role in hacking thousands of his personal emails, an intrusion he said Donald Trump's campaign may have been aware of in advance. And I think 2 years later, this idea that Trump or Trump campaign officials actually participated in the hack, were conspirators in the hack, worked with the Russians in order to perpetrate it, or even knew in advance about it, has essentially completely disappeared. I don't hear anybody ever making that claim anymore. Vanessa went through the indictments that the Mueller investigative team has issued, and they basically fall into two categories. One, financial crimes, money laundering, and the like of Paul Manafort and Rick Gates and their associates. Or two, lying to the FBI about FBI contacts. None of the Mueller indictments have alleged any kind of criminal conspiracy or criminal collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And there's an article in Political this morning warning that the Mueller report, which is scheduled to be issued after the election, is likely to be highly disappointing to those people who were expecting it was going to be some kind of a fatal blow to the Trump presidency, because it's unlikely to include any of those kinds of allegations if it ever becomes public at all. So that's the first point I think is important to make, is to see how the kind of ground has shifted in terms of what has been alleged as the evidence has failed to support the initial story. And then the other point that I would add is it's really important to keep in mind what the implications of this sort of thing might be, by which I mean just Russia involvement in whether the 2016 election or the Brexit referendum. For example, with the Brexit referendum, there were allegations that Russia was involved in trying to incite leave sentiment, but then Wired in December 2017 said Facebook claims Russia paid for 3 ads around Brexit, costing $73 Pence. And then in March of 2018, The Guardian said Facebook finds no substantial evidence of Russian meddling in EU referendum. And then when people complained about that, the BBC in June reported Facebook says no evidence of Russian meddling in the Brexit vote. And my position is not that the Russians didn't do things to incite divisive sentiments or in some way try to involve themselves in the political affairs of the US. My position is that it's extremely important to put it into proper perspective so that we can talk about it the right way, whether this is really some kind of wildly aberrational rogue behavior on the part of the Russians to sow divisiveness or to otherwise interfere in the discourse of Western democracies, or whether it's something that the US and the UK and its allies have done for decades, not just to other countries, but to Russia as well. Not in order to say that if we do it, it means that Russia's doing it is morally justified, but to keep it in perspective in terms of understanding how we ought to think about it. And I guess my perspective is informed by two things. One, that I live in a country that suffered under a military dictatorship for 21 years because the US and the UK worked with generals in Brazil to overthrow the democratically elected government and then proceeded to impose a regime of military rule that used torture and summary executions for 21 years. And then more recently spent 2 years of my life reading through documents from NSA and GCHQ showing how those agencies target every conceivable and imaginable institution, not just adversary governments, but allied governments, economic institutions, human rights organizations, and not just collect the information, but weaponize it as well. And that's why I tend to be very skeptical of the idea that what Russia is doing, even if you accept all the maximalist claims about their quote-unquote interference in Western democracies, that we ought to consider it to be aberrational as opposed to the normal course of events in terms of how large powers have always dealt with one another and continue to deal with one another. And then just quickly, the last point that I would make that Vanessa asked is how have your views changed? My view throughout 2016 and 2017 was always that there was no evidence presented by the US government to substantiate their narrative that Vladimir Putin ordered the GRU to do the hacking of Podesta and DNC's emails. And I think that's true. There wasn't any evidence presented in 2016 or 2017, and therefore we ought to be skeptical. I think there now is some evidence in the public domain, primarily in the form of the recent Mueller indictment of GRU officials that was very detailed, that the GRU was likely involved in that hacking. I still don't think there's evidence that Putin himself ordered it. So it's not that my views have changed of what happened here, but I think the nature of the evidence has evolved over time. I don't think there's much evidence that Russia played a major role in Brexit, but my view of the geopolitical significance has remained pretty constant, and it's what I described earlier. So that's sort of the summary of my views.
Thank you so much. Mary, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be able to put my views as well. But Glenn Greenwald has in fact put so many of my views that I'm going to add a bit of slightly different details and perspective, but basically everything that Glenn has said, I absolutely subscribe to. The first thing I would say in addition is that I think we have to separate two things that the Russians may have been doing in whatever they were hacking. Were they trying to manipulate an election? My answer to that would be no. If they were hacking, what they were doing, in my view, was they were looking for information, because this was a particularly opaque election. And my view is that practically any intelligence service worth its salt would have been doing exactly the same thing. That the British would have been doing it, the French would have been doing it, the Israelis would have been doing it, and the Russians would have been doing it. But the purpose in all these cases was probably not to try and swing the election. It was rather to find out what on earth was going on in this very peculiar election. I would also add, just as a sideline, an even more conspiratorial view, which I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to, but I think you could make as much of a case for British interference in the American presidential election as you can for Russian interference in the election. And I would base that on the fact that it was GCHQ that even boasts that it tipped off the Americans to the fact that the Democratic computers were being hacked. And second of all, that of course it's an ex-MI6 guy, Chris Steele, who was responsible for the dossier against Trump, which was hawked around Washington and media outlets and basically anybody who would listen and publish it, which nobody did until after the event. But somebody was actually trying to influence the election against Trump, but I don't think it was the Russians. The second thing I would say, which Glenn didn't mention, is that in the very early days of this whole affair, the Russian ambassador in Washington was in the frame, and the Russians ended up by withdrawing him. Now, it didn't seem to me that anything that the Russian ambassador in Washington had done was in any way incompatible with his duties as an ambassador. It was his job to try and make contacts with all the potential presidents, so both the potential presidents, that he would have meetings with Hillary Clinton's staff and he would have meetings with Trump's staff. And it also has to be mentioned that nobody, it's very hard now, I think, to think back to the time before Trump was elected. But in fact, pretty much for the whole duration of that campaign, up to and including election night, nobody dreamt that Trump was going to get elected. And to look back with hindsight on what was really quite an amateurish effort by a lot of aides and advisors who seemed to have been not particularly familiar with the rules. With hindsight, you say, oh yes, but they should have done, this guy's become president. But actually, during even the latter stages of the campaign, things looked rather different. As to whether my views have changed, they absolutely haven't. In fact, I feel my views my skepticism about Russians trying to manipulate the election actually reinforced by not only the fact that the indictments and prosecutions have largely been nothing to do with Russia, but also because it was interesting, they talked about the probability that the Mueller report is going to be a bit of a disappointment. It's certainly true that so far he's been beavering away without actually producing any substantial evidence that either that Russia tried to interfere in the election or that there was any collusion between the Trump team and the Russians. But also because we have seen the latest piece of evidence, or non-evidence I would cite, is Bob Woodward's book, where he's been working on the Trump story, and he's produced a typically Bob Woodward, extremely exact, extremely precise, no stone unturned version of what went on. And he says that he was unable to find any evidence of collusion or Russian attempts to swing the election.
Thank you. Jim, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm just getting really impatient with this pro-Putin stuff. And it's really late in the game for Glenn to keep using straw men like Chicago Tribune story from 2016 to prove that the press is wrong on this story. I find that the minority, the views expressed here are overbalanced towards a view that no one who's well informed in the United States would accept. And so I wonder why that is. I'm frankly I'm pretty angry right now because I think we're listening to Russian propaganda that has no basis in truth. And I think that you can go back and look at the evolution of this story over the last couple of years. And I'd be happy to walk you through that. And you'll see that what we know now is it's a much fuller picture today than what we knew 2 years ago. And so if your views haven't changed significantly, then I don't think you've been paying attention. I think the theory, I have a fairly well-informed theory of what I think generally happened in this case, although I obviously can't prove everything. Mueller is still doing his work. Maybe he won't be able to prove collusion. Collusion is not a legal term. It's a kind of a general description of what happened here. And so whether he can find a prosecution, something to prosecute on collusion, may be difficult. But I think it's fairly clear now what happened in general terms. In 2015, the GRU and perhaps some of the other elements of Russian intelligence began a cyber offensive against the United States in a more intense way than they had previously. They did cyber attacks on a whole range of Washington institutions. One of those institutions was the Democratic National Committee. I believe that they were lucky in their ability to hack into the DNC at a time when they couldn't hack some of the other governmental agencies. And they got into the email system of the DNC. I think at that time, the Russians began to think, how could they use this information? And one of the ways they thought about using it was to go after Hillary Clinton after she became president. And then suddenly Donald Trump began to do really well in the Republican primaries. And I think sometime after they had acquired the DNC emails, they thought about turning this stuff over to the Trump campaign. And so what you see in early 2016 is a whole range of efforts by Russians to contact various members of the Trump circle. And I think that was the beginning of an attempt to hand over this material, or to at least make the Trump people aware of what they had and the ability they had to use it. I then think that they began to look for an intermediary to make this stuff public. And in some fashion, they made this available to WikiLeaks, which then transmitted it to the American press, which was happy to make it public. And so I think there was a whole series of events and communications and contacts that the Mueller team has been looking into very seriously. Contacts between Roger Stone and Julian Assange. Contacts between the GRU and WikiLeaks through Guccifer 2.0. Contacts between George Papadopoulos and Joseph Mifsud. Contacts between Paul Manafort and the Russians. And so there's a whole range of ways in which I think the Russians were reaching out to the Trump campaign. Does that mean that the Trump campaign was party to the hack? No. What it means is there was some effort by the Russians to keep the Trump campaign aware of what it was doing, and whether that led to cooperative activity between the Trump campaign and the Russians is something we still are not sure of. But there are so many contacts, so many interesting coincidences, that it's very difficult you really have to go out of your way in a very concerted way to convince yourself that there's nothing to it. So the evidence that the Russians intervened in the election, I think, is beyond dispute. The evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians is growing almost daily. The evidence that the Trump campaign took an active role in the leak is not there. And I think to hold that as the standard for whether or not you're going to believe that there was some witting knowledge by the Trump campaign of what was going on it's a straw man. So I think that what we have seen over the last year or two is a growing body of evidence of a very strong cyber offensive by Russian intelligence. And I think what they have used this model elsewhere. And I think there were a number of people in the Trump campaign who were happy to go along with it. Whether that under, for instance, RICO or some other conspiracy charges could lead to prosecutions of Trump campaign members, I don't know. But I think we have to let the Mueller investigation play out. And I also think you've got to remember that this is both a legal case and a journalistic story. Mueller is confined in the ways in which he can pursue this legally. He's either going to turn over a report to Congress for Congress to act on, either to impeach Trump or to take no action, which could depend on whether the Democrats retake Congress this fall or not. Or he could try to prosecute Trump, which goes against the Justice Department guidelines that a sitting president is never indicted. And so there are limits to what Mueller can do with this information. But it's still, even if Mueller doesn't indict on collusion, it doesn't mean it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean it's still not a story that the press should and will continue to pursue, because I think that the evidence is growing.
Thank you. Jane?
So yeah, on the US side of things, I'm just going to skirt over that because it's been covered very well by James and Glenn, and I have to say I largely agree with what James has just said. I think there's strong evidence that Russia certainly attempted to meddle in the US election in 2016. And we know that from the contact with Trump's team, which we've heard about. And I think Mary's right in that it's not just about, having contact with Russia or Russian ambassadors is not the issue. It's what was discussed in those meetings. It was the meeting between Trump's former security advisor, Michael Flynn, and the Russian ambassador to discuss lifting Obama-era sanctions before Trump came into power. It was a meeting at Trump Tower between Trump's son and the Russian lawyer Natalia, who supposedly offered dirt on Hillary Clinton. So it's not the contact itself which should raise suspicions. It was what was discussed there. And James has covered the WikiLeaks side of things very well, but I do think there's convincing evidence in Robert Mueller's extremely detailed indictment of the 12 Russian military officers, it includes their break-in techniques, their Google searches. It's from an outside perspective, it's very convincing. And in terms of the social media intrusion, I think that's a key issue. And Glenn mentioned that it was found that Russia or Russian agents barely spent any money on Facebook or other social media accounts. But anyone who knows social media knows it's not how much money you spend to post adverts. It's about the viral lift of the posts you get. It's how many people share them. It's how many people interact. That's how you spread influence rather than posting adverts directly. And we know from Facebook that 3,000 Russian accounts reached 126 million voters in America on Facebook alone. And that's not far off the 137 people who voted in the 2016 election. But anyone who's on social media knows that it's largely an echo chamber. It's lots of people arguing and not changing their mind. So for me, the outstanding question that we haven't had a convincing answer to, not just in terms of social media, but alleged Russian interference overall, is whether their attempts had any real impact. And from the evidence I've seen so far, there's no convincing evidence that I've seen that any of this changed the outcome of the election. I think Trump was ultimately put in power because there were so many disaffected Americans who were pissed off with mainstream politics and, yes, the media. And Trump was able to tap into that through this completely fake anti-establishment image of himself. And I think it's a very similar picture in the UK with Brexit. But with Brexit, I think we're further behind the US in terms of what we know. It's still very much emerging, and I think there are lots of valid and worrying questions, but I haven't seen any solid evidence yet that that Russia did interfere with the Brexit vote. I just have a lot of concerns about whether they did, and I'd want to see a full investigation, particularly into things like big Brexit funder Aaron Banks' contact with Russian officials in the run-up to the referendum, which we know he repeatedly lied about. But something we haven't spoken about yet in terms of Britain, and what I do think there is solid evidence of, is a much more chilling form of interference. The use of targeted assassinations by the Russian security services or powerful mafia groups to eradicate and shut down Putin's or the Kremlin's enemies, and the failure of the British authorities to confront it. We obviously had the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko back in 2006 by 2 former KGB spies, which was documented in extremely forensic detail, the polonium trail all over London. And then we had the very similar attack in Salisbury in March this year on Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. They both shared remarkable similarities. Both had fled Russia and the threat of prosecution. Both were former spies for Russia, and both had sought protection and were working with the British intelligence services. And both were mysteriously poisoned over in the UK after they'd sought protection from the US, from Russia, not the US, I'm not going down that line. But there are also similarities to the 14 suspicious Russia-linked deaths that BuzzFeed investigated last year. Now, in this case, every single one of those men, those deaths, had either angered crossed Putin or another powerful Russian figure, or they were connected to somebody who had. In every single one of these cases, pretty much, they'd reported death threats, assassination attempts, being targeted by the Russian security services, or powerful mafia groups. And in every single case, the British police at the time ruled they weren't suspicious, often without carrying out basic investigation, CCTV checks, witness interviews, anything you would normally expect a police investigation to carry out. And for our investigation, we spoke to multiple US intelligence sources at various agencies over there who told us that basically Russia had been carried out a series of targeted assassinations in the UK, and that the British government were too afraid to retaliate because of the millions coming through flowing through Russia to the UK.
I just want to actually ask you about that point, if I could, because I want you to talk a little bit about that work that you did, which is really so impressive. But the contention of those stories that Jane and her team worked on was that there was like essentially a deal between Russia and the UK that the UK wouldn't go after people who were involved in these killings because it didn't want to risk its relationship with Russia, mostly its economic relationship. So, I mean, it strikes me as a kind of collusion that we haven't talked much about. What do you think about that? I mean, is that...
Well, I think a deal might be going slightly too far, but what we were told and what the evidence we've shown suggests was that the British authorities were simply too afraid to take any action against Russia. And, you know, there's the 14 deaths we investigated, of course, but then there's the black and white evidence of the death of Alexander Litvinenko, where Theresa May, for years, refused to open a public inquiry, even putting in writing the fact that one of the reasons that she cited was because of she wanted to protect Russian international relations with Russia. And to me, it doesn't get more black and white than that. And then, of course, there were the 17 intelligence sources in the UK and the US that we spoke to for our investigation, who all independently said the same thing, that this had been raised with the British authorities, and nothing had happened, partly because of this fear of retaliation, partly because of the desire to protect the Russian billions flowing through the UK, and partly because of police incompetence.
I'm just going to actually ask Mary to come in here because
Yes.
I know she wants to talk about this.
I'm desperate to come in and at least put a few qualifications here, because I think that, first of all, the equivalence as between Skripal's and Litvinenko, I think, is very dubious. The two are actually quite different because Skripal was a swapped spy, which gives him a totally different status. I would also question, though, I agree, there's a lot of things which are not explained here. But to argue that Russians, especially rich Russians and enemies of Putin in London, don't die of natural causes, I think maybe sort of takes things a bit too far. The particular one that I would question is probably the one that seems to many people the most open and shut case, which is Boris Berezovsky. I think there are excellent reasons why Boris Berezovsky would have committed suicide, and that is one of the supposed killings that I actually find least credible in that respect. The suggestion that there's some sort of deal between with the British authorities saying no, we're not going to investigate because these guys are bringing so much money into the economy. I mean, Jane said, well, she wouldn't go as far as to talk about a deal. I wouldn't go anywhere near talking about a deal because I think there are. First of all, the UK police, as we've seen in so many other cases, aren't necessarily wonderful about clearing up crimes, even murders. But the biggest argument for me is that pretty much every one of these individuals, either we know had links with British intelligence, or we can suspect that they had links with British intelligence. In other words, that they had minders, they met people, they fed in information. And this is something that first binds them all together. We saw that the case that immediately followed the Skripal case, which has totally vanished from the news, which is a guy called Glushkov, who was at the top of Aeroflot Airlines, accused of embezzlement in Russia, sought asylum in the UK. He was first declared dead of natural causes, then it was said he'd been murdered. At that point, it just vanished from the news. But the moment there is an intelligence angle on any of these cases, they completely vanish behind a curtain of secrecy. The Skripal case, it was less than 48 hours when the local police lost control of that case. It was declared a terrorism case, and it went to the security services as well as the Metropolitan Police. Now, it seems to me that that is a much better explanation of why these things vanish behind a veil than any lack of zeal in pursuing them. It is because there's an intelligence angle.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. I'm just going to stop you there because I want to shift tacks a little bit. So a lot of this alleged meddling has happened online, and I'd love to have either Jim or Glenn or both talk a little bit about, this is a very tricky subject, actually, how to deal with what's essentially a free platform for people to say whatever they want, and like for any country to use that to influence various populations. I mean, the US has done that, other countries have done that. There has been like a pretty compelling argument made, I think, by, some other people might not find it as compelling as I do, by Kathleen Hall Jamieson recently in her book that this actually may have been enough or was enough to change the course of the US election. How do we deal with that? I mean, what should we do to monitor those platforms? Should we not be putting any restrictions on them? What's the best way to handle that?
Well, in my opinion,
So,
I can go.
go ahead, Jim.
You want, either way.
I don't care.
All right. So just before, so I just want to say, and I know it's not directly responsive to your question, but I nonetheless feel compelled am entitled to address it quickly, is I know emotions can run high in this conversation, I guess, but I would hope we could refrain from things like accusing people of being pro-Putin or disseminating Russian propaganda because certain people
I think
disagree with you. And no, I think it's important actually not to let that comment go to go unaddressed. Jim, just let me finish.
No,
I sat and listened to you accuse people of being pro-Putin and being spewing Russian propaganda, and it was extremely offensive.
No.
So
Hey, Glenn,
I think we ought to confine ourselves.
You know, Glenn,
to
you use this straw man argument every time, where you call out a story from 2 years ago.
Do we have any rules for the panel that like, we should let other people finish talking before they get to talk? Vanessa, do we have it? Can Jim just interrupt whenever he wants?
No, actually, sorry. Can we just hear Glenn, and then we'll hear Jim? Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Because we can't hear either of you at this
great.
point. Thank you.
Yeah. So, you know, and I think that there is, in terms of what Vanessa just asked and what we've been talking about, an important aspect to that, which is where Americans and British subjects were in London. And so there is a tendency, I think, to say, well, let's look at it from the American and British perspective. And when somebody says, oh, the Russians are doing bad things to our country, we clap and cheer. And we're much less interested in the things that we've actually been doing to the rest of the world, including the Russians. And when you ask, Vanessa, as you just did, about things like the use of online platforms, you know, there's a 2011 Guardian article, the headline of which is U.S. secretly created Cuban Twitter to stir unrest and undermine government. It talks about how the U.S. created a Twitter that was designed to be innocuous information, celebrity stuff, sports stuff that would lure Cuban youth onto it and then inject into it U.S. government propaganda that would be hidden. I worked for years on a division of GCHQ called JTRIG, which puts fake online platforms, fake online identities to disseminate, to infiltrate other countries' political discourse. And I say that again, not to say that we do it and therefore it's okay that the Russians do it, but the question of how can we stop this, I think necessarily requires us to examine our own conduct that contributes to it, even though it's not as fun and doesn't lead to as much applause and patriotic cheering, because we've helped create a framework in which the internet is now a weapon to intrude into the affairs of other countries. And the US and the UK use it very aggressively against Russia and other countries. And so I think if we want to think about how to stop that, we should think about things like cyber defenses, but also helping to establish international norms. That means we shouldn't just have panel discussions about what the Russians do, but also about what we and our allies do that are at least as pernicious, if not more so. And then the other two just quick points on that. You know, the issue of the Chicago Tribune article that Jim described as a straw man because it was a media mistake. I actually cited that it wasn't a Chicago Tribune claim. It was a claim by the Democrats in 2016 that the crime that was committed here was that the Trump campaign participated in the hacking. And the reason I mention it is because we've now shifted away from that to what Jim described, I think more or less accurately, that the Trump campaign was interested in receiving information that they thought could be harmful to their political opponent, Hillary Clinton. And I think it's very important to note that receiving information that has been stolen or pilfered by somebody else is not a crime. If it were, nobody on this panel would be here. We would all be in prison. I definitely would be. Jim definitely would be. I think everybody on the panel would be. And the Democrats would be as well. The Democrats, as Mary said, sent people to Russia to talk to Russian officials to get dirt on Trump. They sent people to work with the Ukrainian government to get dirt on Trump and Manafort. So getting dirt on your political opponent from adversaries is not criminal, and I don't think it's out of the norm. And I think the point that Jane made is really the critical point, which is, as Jane said, Trump won because he tapped into what was very widespread and serious and pervasive discontent in the United States because of globalization and free trade destroying the middle class. I think that's the same reason Brexit won. I think that's the reason why fascism in the country in which I live, Brazil, is rising. I think it's the reason extremism is spreading throughout Europe. And I think that it's much easier.
Glenn, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to stop you
just-
because I want to give Jim a chance to respond, and then we just want to go to questions briefly, okay? I'm sorry.
Okay,
We're running out of time.
Sure.
That's fine. I just think, first of all, I think the this event should be like an advertisement for the diversity of opinions at the Intercept, and to show that we are a full-service news organization.
Something for everyone.
And so I think one of the things that Glenn talked about was, the economic anxiety that Trump tapped into. He certainly did, but he also tapped into racism and misogyny. And you could argue that Hillary Clinton lost for many different reasons, possibly because she was a woman. And I think you could also argue that the Russians had an effect. You can't quantify in an election like the American presidential election what was the conclusive effect of Russian interference. I think it had an effect. Whether it was the deciding factor, I don't know that we'll ever know. But to doubt that the Russians were trying to have an effect on the elections, I think is a mistake today. And to say that because the United States does this overseas, it's okay that the Russians did it to us. You can make that argument. I've written many, many, many stories about the U.S. intelligence operations overseas that the U.S. did not want me to write. And also I've written about efforts by the United States to overthrow foreign governments. There's no question that the United States has done that for decades and continues to do it. That doesn't make what the Russians did in the US election right. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't write about it, or that as an American I shouldn't care a lot about it. So, and I think if you look at the way the Trump campaign responded when they got the material from the Russians, in each case they were willing recipients. And the question, certainly the question still is, were they participants or just recipients? I'll grant you that is still an open question. But I think that is almost a distinction without a difference, ultimately, because they knew, I believe they knew that the Russians were interfering in the election on their behalf and were happy about it and didn't try to stop it.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop you there because I want to take a few questions.
Can you explain that? I'll have to go.
Yes, Mary is going to have to leave in 4 minutes. So when she runs off the stage, that's why. Right here, can we have a microphone, please? You can shout, but you've got somebody coming to you right now.
So I would like to ask all of you to talk about a few names here. Robert Mercer, Steve Bannon, Carol Cadwalladr, Chris Wylie. I live in France, so I watched Marine Le Pen go with Nigel Farage before in July and August, and they had tried to get secret meetings to Trump. Marine Le Pen is up for all kinds of financial investigations related to Russia. So is Farage. We know that the government even said, I want you guys to say what has happened to Cambridge Analytica? Why is it under the carpet? Why is nobody doing this? The whole vote was a fraud. It was distorted, it's a fraud.
Okay,
and Chris Wylie took $60 million because he's
I'm
from
sorry.
Vancouver.
I'm going to just have to ask you to frame a question. Do you have a question? Okay, somebody who has a question, please. This gentleman.
The question is not why the Russians would like to do that, because they would not be doing their job if they didn't try that. The question is us in the Occidental world, why do we accept Pyrrhic victories like this, compromising our values, allowing ourselves to win elections by methods that are repugnant?
Okay, anybody want to address that?
You mean, why does the United States accept the fact that this happened? I don't think we do accept it. I mean, I think that's why there's a Mueller investigation going on. It's why the press has been investigating this. And I think the American people don't accept it. The problem is that Trump continues to say it didn't happen. And there's a certain number of people who accept that or believe that. And I think the evidence is growing that it did happen, and that Trump's people around him cooperated or were at least witting of it. And so, to me, that's why this story is so important. The question, the basic question we now face is, did the President of the United States get elected with the help of a foreign country?
Okay.
Which is something we've never had to think about in the United States before.
Do we have one more question? Anywhere over here?
Thank you so much for this excellent discussion so far. My question is around I guess the reason why everyone's frustrated about the Brexit vote and the collusion, potential collusion, is that it lends this illegitimacy to the leadership across society. But is this not a mere distraction? Because more fundamentally, there are things like gerrymandering in the US that are leading to an unequal, undemocratic society. And while we spend countless hours investigating this collusion story, I feel like there are significant fundamental problems. For example, it's predicted that in 2040, I believe that 70% of Americans will live in 20 states. They'll be represented by 40 senators. So the structure of the republic itself seems to be illegitimate and promoting illegitimacy. So would the panel sort of talk about that also, please?
Anybody want to address that? That's a good question.
That's a growing problem in the United States. But you got to remember that when the Constitution was written, it was even more unequal. You had to be a white man who was a property owner to vote. The Senate was elected by state legislatures until the 20th century. So there's been inequality in the United States throughout its history.
Yeah, sure, Mary, go ahead.
Could I just jump in here? I agree that there are a million things wrong with electoral systems on both sides of the Atlantic, and especially in the US. I was Washington correspondent during the tied election of 2000, and the idea that you couldn't actually, that it was physically impossible to have a recount in a crucial state in a US presidential election was, to me, completely extraordinary. So I think that the difficulties and the potential for manipulating election through the social media, that is certainly something to be looked at and considered, but it's only one of a million things that need to be looked at in the conduct of elections. And the same applies to constituencies in the UK. In the last election, the elections is actually fought in a very small number of constituencies, which are marginals. Everywhere else, there's almost no campaigning because those are safe seats. And that is a complete fault with our democracy. Before I leave, which I'm going to leave, I want to say one thing, lest there be any sort of misapprehension. I am not Russian. Because sometimes the BBC, for instance, seems to be under the idea that I am. My name is my married name. My late husband was an American of Russian-Ukrainian refugee parents from the Second World War. I have absolutely no links with the current regime in Russia or Russia at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everyone.